This is a grade 8 response 4, and it was obviously shared as a 4. And I would like to get a look at what what it is so that you can see that. The whole point behind a 4 is a top score in the PSSA TDA. And what you really need to notice is how the introduction is built and how the passage, of course, uses direct quotes from the poem. Now, if you remember from this, the question asked, what was the role of nature in myths? And write an essay analyzing the role of nature in both the passage and the poem, and then using evidence from both the passage and the poem to support the response. So what we find in this is nature in both was a beautifully tragic thing in both. It was a beautiful thing in the passage from Icarus and Daedalus because it helped Daedalus create an idea of how to escape Crete. In the passage it says, watching the seagulls in the air, the only creatures that were sure of liberty. He thought of a plan for himself and his young son, and Icarus, who was captive with him. And in that sentence, it shows that nature gave him the idea of escape, and the birds flying gave him the great idea that he could escape with his son to a new life. And as you read on, you learn how nature is also a tragic thing. As the sun melts the way, you have the feeling of impending sadness. And in the passage from Icarus and Daedalus, it says, warmer and warmer grew the air. Those arms which had seemed to uphold him relaxed. His wings wavered and drooped, and he fluttered his young hands vainly. He was falling, and in the terror he remembered the heat of the sun had melted the wax from his wings. And in that passage it shows how you had forgotten about the sun and only thought of the heavenly beauty that he believed would be above him. Whereas in the poem, Icarus, it talks of when he is falling and what he could have thought of. In the stanza, it says he laughed and admitted that even he had known of the many failings of fathers and feathers, and he would have done it anyway. Those stanzas prove it didn't matter, and what the weather would have been like, he would have flown there either way. He couldn't blame nature for allowing the glue to melt, and although the sun was not hot enough to melt the wax, it was he who decided to make the decision to go that high. That proves that although nature is a beautifully tragic thing, it also has a human error that can cause it. Now let's take a look at why this one is scored a 4. There's a very strong explanation here that goes along with the response. And in this case, the response effectively addresses all parts of the task, demonstrates an in-depth understanding of the text, and strong organizational structure that effectively supports the controlling idea that nature in both the passage and the poem was a beautifully tragic thing. That was presented in the introduction, if you remember, the introduction that the student wrote right here, where he says, nature in both ways was a beautifully tragic thing, in both. Then the other thing that this does well is it, to begin the development of the idea, the student focuses on a positive or the beautiful role that nature plays in the story of Icarus, and in providing inference that nature helped Daedalus create an idea of how to escape Crete. So a well-chosen text reference supports the inference, like watching the seagulls in the air. And the only creatures that were sure of liberty, he thought of a plan for himself and his young son Icarus, who was captive with him. And it is then connecting that effective analysis in that sentence, and it shows that nature gave him the idea of escape. And then to talk about the birds flying gave him the great idea he could escape with his son to the new life. But next, the student shifts focus to a tragic aspect of the role that nature plays in the story by means of effective context providing analysis. So as you read on, you learn how nature is also a tragic thing. And this is an interesting, what we call a shift in what the student does here with the piece. So he goes back here, and then as you read on, you understand right here that nature is also a tragic thing. So a lot of very interesting word choice that the student is also using. The punctuation is very nicely done. The student's handwriting is legible, obviously, but just because you might think your handwriting's not legible doesn't mean that somebody can't read it. But what the comparison did was it took the duality of that which is beautiful, but yet is tragic. And it nicely compared and pulled text evidence from both poems. So when you're doing a comparison essay for a TDA, it may not be quite as long, but that compare contrast that you have to put into it would allow you to be able to quote one poem, find a commonality, and then also find an interesting perspective of which both poems have some type of characteristic about them, which is worth in your, talking about in your analysis. So without further ado, writing a 4 might be a little difficult because it means you're getting the highest score possible. Is it very possible for you to do so? 3s and 4s are very possible. Good luck on the PSSA 8th graders, and we will take a look at another 4 next week.